Hello, I'm Kate Rayworth from Donut Economics Action Lab, and in this video we're exploring the importance of creating economies that are distributive by design. Beliefs about trends in income inequalities have long been shaped by the work of the American economist Simon Kuznets, who in the 1950s took the little data that was available from the UK, the US and Germany and used it to study the relationship between economic growth over time and income inequality within a country. He was surprised by the results he found, that the relative distribution of income has been moving towards equality. And he noted within his paper that this was based on 5% empirical information, 95% speculation, some of it possibly tainted by wishful thinking. He admitted that it was perilously close to pure guesswork and asked that no unwarranted dogmatic generalizations be made. But these were made. And after Kuznets, people started to draw this curve, calling it the Kuznets curve. And what it seems to show is that as income per capita rises in an economy over time, inequality will rise at first, but then it will decrease. And this whispers out a very powerful message that growth will even things up again. It underpins the justification for trickle-down economics, the claim that a rising tide will eventually lift all boats, and that in conditions of austerity, if there's no pain, there will be no gain. Many decades later, the economist Thomas Piketty came back and looked at this era that Kuznets had studied with far richer data. And what Piketty found was that Kuznets had actually been looking at a very particular period in economic history, with data starting before World War I and comparing that to after World War II. Piketty found that it's actually war that destroys the capital of the wealthy. And it was post-World War II that governments massively invested in public health, public education, and public housing. So it was war and government action that bent the curve down in those countries, not the inherent workings of the market. But the myth that growth will even things up again has a very, very long tail. Looking at trends in income inequalities within countries over the whole of the 20th century up until now show clearly that income inequalities have sharply risen in many countries, particularly since 1980, with a strong increase in the share of national income going to the richest 10% of people. This is on income inequality, but the story on wealth inequality is even more extreme. Across every region of the world, the richest 10% of people within nations own around 60 to 80% of the nation's wealth, while the poorest half, the poorest 50% of people own less than 5% of the wealth. These are extreme levels of inequality. We have effectively, from the 20th century up till today, inherited economies that are tending to be divisive, capturing opportunity and value in the hands of a few. There is no chance of getting into the donut, of meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet in such inequitable economies. It's essential, if we are to get into the donut, to create economies that are far more distributive by design, that share opportunity and value far more equitably with all who co-created, and that turns out to be the whole of society. There are many policies that governments can enact to create a far more distributive economy by design. And this table sets out a spectrum of such policies for addressing national inequalities, with policies addressing income inequalities on the top row and wealth inequalities on the bottom row, while treating redistributive policies that reduce post-tax inequalities on the left-hand side, and pre-distributive policies that reduce pre-tax inequalities on the right-hand side. Starting with redistributive policies, these tend to be taxes and transfers. In the realm of redistributing income, they are typically progressive income tax, value-added tax, which can sometimes be regressive, hitting the worst off hardest, and social and welfare payments to the worst off. Policies to redistribute wealth are likewise taxes and transfers focused on inheritance tax, property tax, and capital gains tax. When it comes to pre-distributive policies, in terms of income, we have public transfers, which include universal basic income policies, which are being trialled in a wide range of countries and localities now, and public policies such as ensuring minimum wages, labour rights, equal pay policies, and rent control. When we look at policies for pre-distributing wealth, we can see both public investment in universal basic services, ensuring that every person, no matter their personal wealth or personal background, has access free at the point of use of public education, healthcare, sometimes childcare, and access to social housing. These also include policies that enable distributed ownership, such as distributed ownership of businesses through cooperatives and worker-owned companies, community-owned energy systems, community-owned housing, and community land trusts. All of these policies in this table can be used by governments to tackle national inequalities, but the presence of inequality itself can undermine the effectiveness of some of them. Redistributive taxes on income and on wealth can be difficult to raise and implement, since the richest in society will often lobby against them and will have myriad ways to move or hide their own wealth to avoid paying such taxes. Having sufficient funding for public provisioning, such as of healthcare and education, can likewise be constrained by limited tax revenue. And public policies such as minimum wages to pre-distribute incomes may be strongly opposed by the owners of business and other holders of wealth. In contrast, policies that enable distributed ownership of assets, such as businesses, utilities, and housing, start to shift the very ownership of the sources of wealth creation in society, and so shift economic and political power at the same time. Some of these policies are also in use at the subnational level, such as community wealth building, which aims to create distributive local economies that generate value and opportunity with and for the local community. That could be through the use of anchor institutions, schools, hospitals, and local government services that use their power of procurement to purchase locally from community-owned or employee-owned enterprises. Through recruiting employees locally, reaching out and enabling access to people who have historically been marginalised from such opportunities. Through encouraging democratic ownership, such as cooperatives and employee-owned enterprises, and through enabling community land trusts. Likewise, distributive public transit infrastructure that provides access to fast, clean, and affordable public transit for all is distributive because it enables everybody to have affordable transport. This can be achieved through infrastructure such as dedicated bus lanes and free public transport and excellent cycling infrastructure across a city or a locality. And again, distributive public space that creates public luxury and expands the urban commons, so reclaims public space that has traditionally been used for cars and parking and roads, and turning it into playgrounds and public parks and beachfronts, making public space for all. These policies show that distributive design and far more equitable places to live can be created through infrastructure, not only through taxation and through policy. Just as the concept of far more distributive design can be applied locally and nationally, it can also be put to use internationally. Due to legacies of colonialism, the unjust global financial system, and exploitative trade practices, international inequalities remain extreme, and addressing them is going to require global cooperation amongst policymakers. There is currently no country that lives within the donut and meets the needs of all of its people within the means of its living planet. Every country is on a pathway of transformation. Low-income nations need to rise up to meet their people's needs. Can they do this without overshooting planetary boundaries as all before them have done? How could middle-income nations meet their people's needs and simultaneously come back within planetary boundaries? And high-income countries need to massively reduce their ecological overshoot while finally meeting the needs of all of their people, because they certainly have the means to do so. But for this to happen across the range of nations calls for a rebalancing, addressing the global inequalities that lie behind these nations' very different histories and impacts upon one another, from the global north impacting upon the majority world. Policies such as tackling tax havens, introducing a global billionaire tax, democratizing global institutions, and cancelling unjust debt in the name of debt justice are among many policies that are being currently proposed to tackle the scale of global inequalities and to enable the world to transform towards meeting the needs of all within the means of the living planet. To dive into these kinds of international policies, but also examples of national and local policies, see our web-based Policymakers Guide.